I've got to, before we totally leave that subject of the journey continues, I just have to mention, if you didn't see it when you came in, the historical board that's out it's on this side of the foyer, and the special projects team, and I think a lot of that was with Gene and Nancy Stafford putting that board together. Those of you who have been here for a long time will know probably everyone on that board, and those of you who haven't been here that long won't know someone on that board. So grab somebody with gray hair and just say, who are these people? I don't know who they are. Where are they at? I don't know where they're at. But it's a really cool way of showing where this journey began, what its beginnings were, and where it is going to. And if you saw it this week, look again next week, because they're going to be switching pictures in and out. So if you still have pictures that you haven't given to Gene and Nancy or to the leaders of that team, then please get them to them. And we'll make sure that we get some representations up there. So keep looking at it week to week. It's going to be different. The ideas that I'm going to present to you in this sermon today came from two main sources. One of them is the Bible. We try to do that here at Cadiz occasionally, actually use the Bible, and actually Jeff always uses the Bible in his sermon. But the other ideas came from a book by Doctors John Townsend and Henry Cloud called How People Grow. My favorite people, two of my favorite psychologists, called How People Grow. If you haven't read that book and you haven't read the Bible, I recommend both of them highly. The Bible first, John and Henry second. Okay? So I just want to give them credit because a lot of this comes from that. And I hope that you get something out of this that will help you in your walk with God and help you actually grow in your walk with God. I enjoy riding my bike. I've told you this before. As I've gotten older, this actually has kind of become my exercise of choice because my knees will no longer take much running, so I can bike and my knees are okay with that. So a couple summers ago, I got on the Cardinal Greenway. The Cardinal Greenway starts in, well, at that time anyway, it started in Los Santville, and it goes up to Gaston. So one way, it's 28 miles. So I got on the Cardinal Greenway, and I started biking, and I was probably 10, 15 miles into it, and I was feeling pretty good. My legs felt good. The back felt good. My behind wasn't doing too bad. And I said, I think I can do this whole thing. Now, I'd never ridden this far before on a bike, but I said, I'm going to go for it. And I got up. I was probably within 2 or 3 miles of Gaston, and I'm still thinking, man, for a guy who's 50-something years old, I'm not feeling too bad, And I got to Gaston, and I thought, wow, that's something. I turned around and started pedaling south and realized that whole 28 miles I had ridden north, the wind was at my back. And now it was in my face. The saddest part of that is the realization that I had 28 miles to go to get back to my vehicle. And I got to tell you, I made it. Obviously, I'm here today. But I tell you, that last 5 miles, oh, it was bad. My legs, my behind, my everything was really suffering. And those last 2 miles, I kept looking for that car. I was in such tremendous pain. I almost got to the point where I just didn't even feel my legs anymore. They just weren't there. But I finally got to the car, loaded the bike up, started my drive back home, and the pain that I had felt in those last few miles was only equaled by the pain that I felt when I got out of the car when I got home because I was so sore. It was a lot of pain. But my point is, we know that exercise, the pain that we get from exercise is actually good pain. Because physiologists tell us that those muscles that we're really pushing to the brink, they actually get little tears in them. And God made them so that they would repair themselves, and the muscle is actually in better condition after it's repaired than it was when we started out. So that's good pain. So when Jeff and I were talking about where I was going to fit this sermon in this series, I'm glad that it ended up being the last sermon in this series on overcoming life's roadblocks. Because we need to understand that there is such a thing as good pain. We've talked a lot. I think Jeff opened this sermon series talking about pain and God walking with us through that dark night of pain. And that's true. But not all pain is bad. Some pain is actually good. Let me illustrate it to you this way. If you leave an event and go into a dark parking lot and you're accosted by a guy with a mask who stabs you in the stomach, takes all of your money, and leaves you unconscious, you would call him a mugger. But if somebody came to that parking lot and picked you up and took you into a brightly lit room where a guy with a mask walks in, he opens up, he cuts your stomach open, he takes all of your money, and he leaves you unconscious, you would call him a surgeon, and you would thank him for saving your life. Both of those involve pain. One is bad. Some would say both is bad in some ways, but actually one is good and one is bad. And in our life, we need to understand the difference between the two. When we're going through pain, there is pain that is inflicted by evil people in our lives that we had nothing to do with. And that pain is bad. But there is pain that comes into our life that is redemptive, that has value to it. And we need to know the difference between the two because we approach the two differently. So let me start by talking about good pain. Pain that brings growth. And let me talk about that by talking to you about a guy named Dan. Dan was a really bright student in school. Had awesome grades in high school. He went to one of the best business universities in the United States. When he graduated, he immediately got a job with a Fortune 500 company. And he was very successful. Within half a dozen years, he was the CEO of that company. He was so good at what he did. And his personal life was just as good. He married his high school sweetheart. Her name was Abby. He married Abby, and because he was able to provide substantially for his family, Abby was able to realize her lifelong dream of being a stay-at-home mom. They had a good life. They had an awesome life. Things were clicking for them. But you're waiting for the sinister music, aren't you? There is sinister music. Because at one point, Dan had made some investments with this company as CEO in an area of business that was not successful. Matter of fact, they lost everything that he had invested. And because of that, Dan's board of directors were getting a little nervous. But he still had a few members on the board that really liked him and really believed in what he was doing. But then they started getting messages from the stockholders, and things continued to be bad for Dan, and eventually Dan was fired. And this stress that Dan was feeling at work was spilling over into his home life. His responses to Abby became short and angry. And he had totally disconnected from his children with the exception of expressing his impatience with them. Dan disconnected from his high school sweetheart, and over time, Abby became so disheartened that she filed for divorce. Now, to be fair, they'd experienced some strains in their marriage before, but for Abby, this was the last straw. She couldn't take it anymore. And both of them felt like they were living in a fog. They just kept thinking to themselves, I don't understand. What happened? Where did this go wrong? I mean, we were so happy, and our lives were so good, and things were going along just exactly as we'd planned them to be. And now we're here, in the middle of divorce proceedings, not speaking to each other. How could this be? And maybe the most important question to them was, where is God in all of this? Because both of them were active in their church. They were raising their kids in the church environment. Both of Abby and Dan were raised in godly homes. And yet, things just seemed to be deteriorating at a speed that they just couldn't do anything about. As if by divine intervention, one of those board members that believed in Dan recommended that he see a therapist. And in fact, he made the appointment for Dan because Dan was in a state, he wanted to save his marriage, but he just didn't know what to do next. He was just in a panic as to what to do next. I told you that Dan was raised in a godly home, and that's true. What I didn't tell you was that what Dan discovered when he went to this therapist was that he was about to have an opportunity to suffer some good pain. Because when Dan was growing up, his dad died when Dan was just a toddler. And his mother, who obviously was traumatized by the untimely death of her husband, became bitter and angry. And because of that, little Dan was required to nurture himself. And as Dan grew older, that actually worked pretty good for him because he had a lot of brains and a lot of talent. And he became a star athlete in high school. I already told you his grades were phenomenal. And so life was pretty good for Dan. And because he was very involved in his school, he made some great connections. And those great connections got him into that university I told you about. And then the connections that he made in that university got him that great job. So life was pretty good for Dan. But then things came to a crushing halt. Because what Dan found out about himself was that when he was performing well, life was good. Life was really good. But what he found out later, and what Abby had realized early in their marriage, was that when he failed, when he got a bad grade, or he lost a football game, or he made a bad deal, it absolutely devastated him. He couldn't handle it. It was just too much for him to deal with. Dan believed that his value was in his performance. When he was good, he was good. When he was bad, he was really bad. Like a lot of people, frankly, like a lot of Christians, he believed that his value was in his own ability, not in Jesus Christ. He was a Christian. But he couldn't get that. And as he and Abby sat in that therapist's office, the thing that probably rocked his world the most was the fact that while he had successfully taken care of all those issues earlier in his life, he couldn't nurture himself out of this one. So he wasn't sure what to do. But Dan was about to find out that even though all of those things that had happened to him as a young man and as a child was bad pain, that was evil inflicted on him by something that he had no control over, he was about to find out that all of that was about to become good pain as he worked through the issues that he was dealing with. But as I mentioned earlier, bad pain is not always good. Bad pain, the kind where we just sit in it and we don't do anything about it, it's just basically wasted pain. I mean, it's just pain. It doesn't really have value. It just is. It just kind of controls our life. Jesus talked about this a little bit in Luke chapter 11. He was telling a parable. And he said in verse 24, when an impure spirit comes out of a person, it goes through arid places seeking rest and doesn't find it. Then it says, I will return to the house I left, and when it arrives, it finds the house swept clean and put in order. Then it goes and takes 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there, and the final condition of that person is worse than the first. This is Dan. Because Dan spent his whole life cleaning that room inside of him, sweeping it out. So there was nothing in there that was bad. The problem was, Dan never included God in that process. It was always Dan taking care of Dan's problems. And because of that, as time went on, and as he entered this marriage relationship, it was just like Jesus said. That problem brought back 7 more problems with it, and it was worse then than it was in the beginning. The funny thing is, and the thing that often we don't realize, is that God will frequently do miracles to deliver people from something in their life, a bad behavior, a bad habit, whatever. But God rarely delivers us into character, because character is built by decisions that we make over a period of time, often over a period of years. And God has a design for how that's supposed to happen. And that design involves not just us, not just me, not just you. It involves people. It involves God's people. That's what His plan is for spiritual growth. That's what His plan is in good pain. When you think about it, suffering, we talked about this in Sunday school class 3 or 4 weeks ago. Suffering is very underrated. I mean, when you think about people in the Bible, the iconic people in the Bible, pretty much every one of them were sufferers. They suffered pain. You think about Noah. Here's a guy building an ark. Now, nobody knew what an ark was, but he's building one. And all these people are looking at him saying, what an idiot you are. It hasn't rained in who knows how long. We've never had a flood. They didn't even know what a flood was when he said, we're going to have a big flood. They're like, what is that? I don't know what that is. And yet, Noah chose to suffer that pain because he knew that's what God wanted him to do. He knew what God had told him, and he believed it to be true. And then, Paul talks about pain. Paul's like the icon of pain in the New Testament, with the exception of Jesus. He talks about pain all the time. But then there's this guy named Peter. And Peter, as he was writing his epistle, 1 Peter chapter 4, he says this, "Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude. Because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin." Now that is a very powerful verse about good pain. Whoever suffers in his body is done with sin. Perhaps the most interesting thing about that verse is the guy who wrote it. Because Peter was a guy who didn't care for suffering. If we think about young Peter, at the time Jesus was walking the earth, he was the guy who sat around the campfire and said, "I don't know who that guy is. I don't know who Jesus is." He'd walked with him. He'd seen him do miracles. He said, "I have no idea who you're talking about. I know nothing about him," because he wasn't willing to suffer the pain and the ridicule and potentially prison that would be involved in saying, "Yeah, I was with him. Yeah, I believe he's the Savior of the world." And just a few days earlier, Peter had said, "I'll do anything for you, Jesus. I'll die for you." He's also the guy who, when Jesus told him that he was going to die, that Jesus was going to die and be crucified, that Peter immediately said, "No, that cannot be true." And Jesus rebuked him. But beyond rebuking him, Jesus gave a lesson to those that were standing there. This is in Matthew 16. He said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." Peter was not about suffering, but he learned over time the value of suffering. He learned that walking with Jesus wasn't really walking with Jesus unless there was pain involved, good pain involved. And I think about Peter writing those verses, and I think he must have had a smile on his face as he thought about young, brash Peter, and then he thought about the Peter in the book of Acts who preached to thousands of people the gospel of Christ, the value of Christ's suffering on the cross for us. Arm yourselves with that same attitude, because he who has suffered in his body is done with sin. I want to leave you today with information in your mind about the greatest sufferer of all, Jesus Christ. And I think that when we think about Jesus' suffering, the best picture could be painted by Paul in Philippians. Philippians chapter 2, Paul says, talking about Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Jesus emptied himself of being God. It's an interesting concept for us because we often, I'm not even sure often is the right word, we always desire to be God in our lives. It's part of our sinful nature. Remember Adam and Eve? Remember what Satan said to them when he was tempting them to take the fruit? One of the things he said was, God doesn't want you to eat this fruit because then you will be God. And ever since they ate that fruit, we all have a desire to be God. We all believe that we have the best idea. We all believe that we have the best plan. We all believe that we can solve all the problems in our life on our own, just like Dan did. Funny thing is that Christ didn't die for us to make us super smart. He didn't die for us so we could figure out all the problems that we have in our life and everything would be neat and tidy and taken care of. He died for us because we aren't super smart. He died for us because we can't save ourselves as much as we believe that we can, as much as Dan believed that he could do that. He died for us because we could not. He also died for us because we aren't big enough to solve our problems. But he is. And God delivered to us the Holy Spirit to help us in that pursuit. I mean, really, when it comes down to it, all we're talking about here is the process of sanctification. That's all it is. And it seems easy to say, but to live it out is painful. To really seek to be more like Christ is very painful because it pushes against that sinful nature that lives in us. So while there is pain that seems needless, that seems so horrific, there can't possibly be any good thing in it. Any good thing produced by it. I'm here to tell you that every pang that you feel in your life, regardless of the source, God can redeem. Makes no difference what it is. And I'm sure there are many in this room who have had horrific things done to them. Things that they had no control over. And you have lived your life suffering as a result of that pain. What I want you to know is that you don't have to do that. You don't have to fix that yourself. You don't have to live with that yourself. God will help you to turn that bad pain into good pain. Now, I'm perfectly willing to admit that there are people in here who are suffering bad pain, who are, have habits or behaviors or ideas that are hindering their lives. And yet, in hearing this sermon, you're still not willing to give that up. You just don't see that there's any way for you to be free of whatever that is in your life. And I get that. So for you, what you've heard today is really just seed planting. I planted a seed today, hopefully, in your mind about whatever that is, that someday, I pray, will bear fruit. But I also believe there are people in here who are suffering pain, who have come to a point where they are willing They are willing to see that, yes, there may be a different way. And in fact, that God might have a different way for me to do something that maybe you've never done in your life, and that is to walk through the pain instead of walking around the pain. So, after I pray, the team's going to come up and sing a song, and I invite you to take that first step today. I invite you to lift yourself out of that chair, and you probably are going to feel like you weigh about 2,000 pounds. Because that first step is hard. It's really hard. But it's worth it. And God, if you can take that first step, God will take it from there. For some of you, that first step is a step of salvation, because the pain that you've been suffering is the pain of not knowing why you're here, what your life is about, what your purpose is from being on this earth. God can answer all of that for you. And for some of you, it really is just, it's a behavior, it's a habit, it's a thought, it's a process of thinking, a way of thinking that God wants to change. That's causing suffering and pain in your life that He can redeem. And I invite you during the invitation to come forward. We'll pray for you, but beyond that, I'll talk with you about it after we get done today. And try to give you some practical thoughts on where you can go and how God can work with you in that situation.